Robert Hayes checked the cargo manifest for the third time that day. Numbers always calmed his nerves, and today he needed calming. The freight hauler had been making strange noises since the last jump, and he still had 2 more deliveries before he could afford proper repairs. The docking clamps engaged with a heavy thunk that resonated through the hull. Orbital Station Freeport 7 stretched out before him through the viewport, a massive ring of metal and lights spinning slowly against the backdrop of a green and blue planet below. Robert had been here twice before. Easy in, easy out, collect payment, move on. He grabbed his data pad and headed for the cargo bay. The station's automated systems had already begun the unloading process. Containers floated past on anti-gravity pallets, guided by robotic arms toward the station's receiving docks. Robert followed them down the boarding tunnel, his worn boots making soft sounds against the metal floor. The receiving area buzzed with activity. Traders from a dozen different species moved between stacks of containers. A tall, blue-skinned Tralian argued with a dock supervisor about tariffs. 2 insectoid Chither scuttled past carrying equipment Robert didn't recognize. Normal chaos. He liked normal. Robert found the dock master, a heavy-set human woman named Patricia, and handed her his credentials. She scanned them without looking up. Hayes, cargo hold, medical supplies, and terraforming equipment. She nodded. Bay 12. Standard offload. You know the drill. Thanks, Pat. He turned to head toward Bay 12 when the screaming started. Not human screaming. Something deeper, more primal. A sound that vibrated in his chest and made his teeth ache. Robert spun around, searching for the source. Other people in the dock had frozen, their faces showing the same confusion he felt. The sound came again, louder this time. Then another voice joined it. And another. What the hell is that? Someone shouted. Patricia was already on her communicator, her face pale. This is dock control. What's happening in the military wing? The answer came through loud enough for Robert to hear. The dragons, ma'am. They've gone insane. All of them. Robert's stomach dropped. Dragons. He heard about them, but never seen one. They were rare, expensive, used by the richest families and most powerful militaries as both weapons and status symbols. Intelligent enough to follow complex commands, strong enough to tear through starship hulls. What were they doing on a civilian station? Seal the military wing, Patricia ordered. Nobody in or out until we know what's happening. But the seals didn't hold. The doors to the military section buckled outward with a shriek of tearing metal. Something massive moved beyond them. Robert saw a glimpse of scales the color of deep ocean water, claws that could have been starship landing gear, and eyes that burned with golden fire. The dragon exploded into the civilian dock. It was enormous, easily the size of a small shuttle, with wings that scraped the ceiling when it spread them. Its head swung back and forth, nostrils flaring. People scattered in every direction, screaming, but the dragon didn't attack. It looked terrified. Its gaze swept across the dock, past Patricia, past the fleeing traders, and locked directly onto Robert. The creature's eyes went wide. It took a step backward, then another. A sound came from its throat, high and keening, almost like a whimper. Then it ran out a dragon. A creature bred for war, trained to face weapons fire without flinching, turned and fled back through the broken doors like a frightened animal. Robert stood frozen. His heart hammered against his ribs. Everyone in the dock was staring at him now. What did you do? Patricia demanded. Nothing. I just got here. Security arrived within minutes. 6 officers in body armor, weapons drawn but not aimed. The lead officer, a scarred Tralian with orange skin, approached Robert carefully. Sir, we need you to come with us. Why? I didn't do anything. The dragons. All of them. They're trying to break out of their containment cells. The officer's voice was steady, but his eyes showed fear. Every single one is trying to get away from this section of the station. Away from you. Robert wanted to argue, to insist this was a mistake, but he saw the faces around him. Saw the fear mixed with suspicion. Saw Patricia backing away, her hand near the emergency alarm. Okay, he said quietly. Okay, I'll come. They took him through empty corridors, past sealed blast doors. Robert could hear the dragons beyond the walls, their cries muffled but constant. How many were there? The sound seemed to come from everywhere. The security office was small and cold. They left him in a holding cell with transparent walls. Not a criminal cell, they assured him. Just a precaution. For everyone's safety, including his. Robert sat on the bench and put his head in his hands. This didn't make sense. He'd never seen a dragon before today. Never worked with animals at all, really. He was a cargo hauler. He moved boxes from one place to another. The most exciting thing that had happened to him in the past year was a faulty navigation computer. Outside the cell, he could see security officers talking in tight groups. Scientists arrived with scanning equipment. A woman in a white coat kept looking at him like he was a specimen in a jar. Through a viewport, Robert could see his ship. His cargo sat undelivered. His payment uncollected. His simple life falling apart because of something he didn't understand. The dragons were still screaming, and Robert had no idea why. 3 days passed in the holding cell. 3 days of tests, questions, and scared faces staring at Robert through the transparent walls. They took blood samples, skin samples, hair samples. They scanned him with devices that hummed and clicked. They asked him the same questions over and over until the words lost meaning. And oh, he'd never worked with dragons. No, he didn't carry any unusual technology. No, he couldn't explain what was happening. The scientist in the white coat visited him every morning. Her name was Dr. Iris Kwan, and unlike the others, she didn't look at him with fear, just intense curiosity. Your bone density is higher than average, she told him on the third day, and your reflexes test faster than normal. But nothing that would explain this. So I can go? Robert asked. She shook her head. More dragons arrived this morning for the Stellar Cup races next month. All of them reacted the same way when they entered the station. She paused. One handler said her dragon wouldn't eat, just cowered in the corner of its cell, shaking. Robert felt sick. I'm not trying to hurt them. I believe you. Dr. Kwan pulled up a chair outside the cell. Tell me about your family. Your parents. They died when I was 8. Meaning accident en titan. After that, my grandmother raised me. Tell me about her. Robert leaned back against the wall. Helen Hayes. She lived in Montana, way out in the wilderness. Old cabin, no neighbors for 50 miles. She taught me to hunt, to track, to read the weather. She knew things about plants, about animals. He smiled slightly. She used to say the old ways were better than new technology. Is she still alive? Yeah, still in that cabin, far as I know. We talk maybe once a year. She's not big on communication devices. Dr. Kwan made notes on her data pad. Did she ever talk about your family history? Where your ancestors came from? Not really. She said our family kept to themselves, that we were different from other people, but she never explained what that meant. Robert frowned. Why does this matter? Before Dr. Kwan could answer, alarms blared throughout the station. Red lights flashed. Her communicator burst to life with panicked voices. Containment breach in Bay 7. The dragon's loose. Dr. Kwan jumped to her feet. Robert pressed against the cell wall, trying to see down the corridor. He heard the sound of massive footsteps, felt the vibrations through the floor. Then came that same terrified roar he'd heard 3 days ago. The dragon appeared at the end of the corridor. It was smaller than the first one, covered in silver scales that reflected the emergency lights. Its wings were folded tight against its body. Blood dripped from its claws where it had torn through restraints. It saw Robert and froze. Security appeared behind it, weapons raised. Don't move. But the dragon wasn't attacking. It was trembling. Its eyes locked onto Robert with what he could only describe as absolute terror. It took a step backward, away from him, and slammed into the wall hard enough to dent the metal. Stand down, someone shouted. It's not aggressive. The dragon made a sound Robert had never heard before, almost like crying. It pressed itself against the far wall, as far from Robert's cell as it could get, and curled into a ball. A creature designed to be a predator, reduced to a whimpering mass of fear. Dr. Kwan spoke quietly into her communicator. Get a tranquilizer team up here. Now. It took 20 minutes to sedate the dragon and another hour to move it back to a reinforced containment cell. Through it all, Robert sat in his holding cell and watched. Watched the handlers approach the dragon carefully. Watched it flinch away from them, but never take its eyes off Robert. Watched them finally inject it with enough sedative to drop an elephant. When they carried it away on an anti-gravity platform, one of the handlers stopped and stared at Robert. "What are you?" the handler whispered. Robert had no answer. That evening, they moved him to a different section of the station, farther from the dragons. The screaming stopped. Dr. Kwan told him the dragons had finally calmed down enough to eat. "Because I'm farther away?" Robert asked. "Yes." He sat on the new cell's bench. "So what happens now?" Dr. Kwan pulled up her data pad and showed him a message. It was from a merchant lord named Orin, owner of the first dragon that had fled from Robert. The message demanded Robert be removed from the station or handed over for extensive testing to determine the nature of his threat. "He's threatening legal action," Dr. Kwan said. "The station commander is considering deportation, sending you back to Earth on the next available transport." "Good," Robert said. "I want to go home anyway. There's something else." She swiped to another file. "I've been digging through restricted archives. There are stories scattered across dozens of different cultures from different worlds. Stories about people who could control dragons. They call them different names. Dragon lords. First ones, the Ardent. Stories aren't real. Maybe not. But there was an incident 70 years ago. A woman on a colony world. Dragons fled from her too. The records are sealed, but I found a reference to it in an old research paper." Dr. Kwan looked at him intently. "She was from Earth. From North America." Robert's mouth went dry. "That's a coincidence. Is it?" Dr. Kwan stood. "I'm trying to help you, Robert. But I need you to think. Is there anything your grandmother told you? Anything strange about your family?" He thought back to cold Montana mornings. Helen teaching him to move silently through the forest. Her hands showing him which plants to avoid, which to harvest. The way animals seemed to watch her with something like recognition. "She said we had old blood," Robert whispered. "I thought she meant we'd been in America a long time." Dr. Kwan nodded slowly. "I'm going to send a message to Earth. To your grandmother. Maybe she has answers." "She won't respond. She doesn't trust technology. Let's try anyway." That night, Robert dreamed of fire and wings and voices speaking in languages that predated words. Helen Hayes was feeding chickens when the message arrived. The communicator on her porch had been silent for months, gathering dust between the old rocking chair and a stack of firewood. When it chirped to life, she almost ignored it. But something made her stop, made her set down the feed bucket and walk slowly to the porch. The screen showed an official header from Orbital Station Freeport 7. Her hand shook as she opened the message. She read it twice. Then she sat down heavily in the rocking chair that they'd found him. After all these years of hoping Robert would live a quiet, normal life, someone had finally noticed what he was. Helen looked out at the Montana wilderness stretching endlessly before her cabin. She'd chosen this place specifically because it was far from everything. Far from cities, far from people, far from questions. She'd raised Robert here for the same reason. Hoping distance would keep him safe, she'd been wrong. Helen stood and walked inside. The cabin was simple, one room with a wood stove and a bed. But beneath the floorboards under that bed was a space she hadn't opened in 26 years. She pulled up the boards and lifted out a leather satchel, worn soft with age. Inside were things she'd hoped never to use again. Seeds preserved in stasis. DNA samples in micro-storage units. A data crystal containing coordinates to a place she'd sworn never to return to. And beneath it all, wrapped in cloth, a small stone that hummed with faint warmth. Helen held the stone and closed her eyes. She could feel the old connections stirring. The blood remembered, even after all this time. She packed quickly. A change of clothes, the satchel, nothing else. The chickens would be fine. The cabin would stand or fall without her. None of it mattered now. The nearest spaceport was 200 miles away. Helen made the call from her rarely used vehicle as she drove. "I need the fastest available transport to Orbital Station Freeport 7. That's a 3-week journey, ma'am. Quite expensive. I'll pay. When can I leave?" "There's a supply hauler departing tomorrow morning. I'll be there." Helen drove through the night, the leather satchel sitting on the passenger seat beside her. She thought about Robert. Sweet, confused Robert, who'd grown up thinking he was just a normal human boy. She tried so hard to give him that gift. Normalcy. A life free from the weight of ancient history. But blood always told in the end. The spaceport was small, just 3 landing pads and a prefab terminal. Helen bought her ticket with credits she'd been saving for decades. The supply hauler was exactly what she expected. Cramped, loud, and smelling faintly of recycled air and machine oil. The crew gave her strange looks. An old woman traveling alone with nothing but a worn bag. But they asked no questions, and she offered no explanations. 3 weeks in space. Helen spent most of it in her tiny cabin, holding the warm stone and remembering things she tried to forget. Her people, her true people, the ones who'd walked the earth when humans were still learning to make fire. The ardent, they'd had many names in many languages. Dragon Lords. First ones. The people who came before. None of the names were quite right. They'd simply been themselves, living alongside the great beasts that would later be called dragons. Not as masters and servants, but as partners. As family. Then came the fire from the sky. The catastrophe that should have ended everything. Helen's people made a choice. They sent the dragons away, scattered them across the stars through ancient technology that even now humanity couldn't replicate. Save them from extinction. And the ardent? They chose to fade, to blend into the emerging human population, to let their bloodline dilute over thousands of generations until nothing remained but occasional echoes. Strange dreams, unusual reflexes, a bone structure slightly denser than normal. Helen had thought she was the last pureblood. She'd married a human man, had a daughter who carried only a trace of the old blood. Not enough to matter, not enough to trigger the ancient recognition, but her daughter had married someone who also carried traces. 2 thin bloodlines combining, and they'd produced Robert. Helen had known the moment she first held him as a baby, felt the strength of the old blood running through him, stronger than it had been in generations. Maybe strong enough to wake the sleeping memories coded into every dragon's DNA. She'd hoped she was wrong, hoped he'd grow up normal. Now she knew different. The supply hauler dropped out of jump space near Freeport 7. Helen stood at a viewport and looked at the massive station spinning against the stars. Somewhere in there, Robert was waiting, confused and scared and completely unprepared for what he was. She had to fix this. Had to tell him the truth she should have shared years ago. The docking process seemed to take forever. When the airlocks finally cycled open, Helen grabbed her satchel and made her way to the immigration checkpoint. The officer looked at her credentials and frowned. Purpose of visit: family emergency. Name of family member: Robert Hayes. He's being held in your security wing. The officer's expression changed. He spoke quietly into his communicator, then looked back at her with something like fear. Ma'am, I need you to wait here. Someone's coming to escort you. Helen waited. She could feel them beyond the walls. The dragons. They sensed her presence just as they'd sensed Robert's. She could feel their confusion, their fear, their buried memories stirring. Dr. Kwan arrived with 2 security officers. The scientist looked exhausted, but her eyes were sharp. Helen Hayes. Yes. Your grandson has caused quite a situation here. I know. That's why I came. Helen looked directly at her. I can explain everything. But first, I need to see Robert. Dr. Kwan studied her for a long moment. Follow me. They walked through corridors that had been cleared of other traffic. Helen could hear the dragons now, their sounds muffled by thick walls. They knew she was here. They remembered. Before we go in, Dr. Kwan said, stopping outside a door marked Security Wing B. I need to know, are you like him? Is that why you came? Helen smiled sadly. I'm exactly like him, Dr. Kwan. I'm what he is, what he's always been. And what's that? Something this galaxy thought was extinct. Helen touched the door. Something the dragons have been waiting thousands of years to find again. She stepped through the door, ready to face her grandson and finally tell him the truth about his blood. Robert looked up when the door opened. He'd been staring at his hands, wondering for the 1,000th time what was wrong with him. Then he saw her. Grandma. Helen Hayes looked older than he remembered, her hair completely white now, her face lined with years. But her eyes were the same, sharp and clear and carrying secrets. She crossed the cell in 3 steps and pulled him into a hug. Robert held her, breathing in the familiar smell of pine trees and with smoke that always clung to her. "What are you doing here?" he asked. "Fixing a mistake I made a long time ago." Helen pulled back and looked at him, really looked at him, in a way that made him feel like she was seeing through his skin. "We need to talk, Robert. About who you are. About who we are." Dr. Kwan stood by the door. "I'll give you privacy." "No," Helen said. "Stay. You've already guessed some of it, I think. You might as well hear the rest." They sat on the bench. Helen kept one hand on Robert's shoulder, grounding him. "I'm not entirely human," she said quietly. "And neither are you." Robert wanted to laugh, wanted to tell her that was impossible. But he looked at her face and couldn't find the words. Helen continued. "My people were called the Ardent. We existed on Earth long before modern humans. Millions of years ago, when the planet was different, when dragons were still young. Dragons came from Earth." Dr. Kwan leaned forward. "Everything did, originally. Earth was the first world, the cradle of so many species that would later spread to the stars." Helen's voice took on a distant quality, like she was remembering something from a dream. "The Ardent lived alongside dragons. We shared a bond with them. Genetic, yes, but also something deeper. Something in our blood that called to theirs." Robert shook his head. "This sounds like a fairy tale." "I wish it was." Helen opened her leather satchel and pulled out the warm stone. It glowed faintly in her palm. "This is Ardent technology. We were more advanced than humanity is even now. We understood genetics, understood consciousness, understood how to weave biology and technology together." Dr. Kwan stared at the stone. "That's impossible. That kind of tech would require understanding physics we haven't even theorized about. Your species is young, Dr. Kwan. You've achieved remarkable things in a short time, but you're not the first to reach for the stars." Helen closed her hand around the stone. 70 million years ago, a catastrophe struck Earth. An asteroid, though not the famous one that killed the dinosaurs. This one was different, smaller, but it carried something worse. A plague, a biological weapon from another world, perhaps, or just cosmic bad luck. "The dragons would have died," Helen continued. "We could see it coming. The plague targeted their specific biology. So we made a choice. We used our technology to scatter them across the galaxy. Sent them to worlds where they could survive, could thrive. Save them from extinction." Robert found his voice. "What happened to the Ardent? We chose to fade." Helen looked at him with sad eyes. "We were dying too. The plague affected us differently, but it still killed. We had maybe a few thousand left. Not enough to sustain our civilization. So we did the only thing we could. We interbred with the early humans who were just beginning to evolve into what you are now. Let our bloodline dilute over thousands of generations." "But why?" Dr. Kwan asked. "Because we wanted life to continue. We wanted our knowledge, our essence, to survive even if we as a people didn't. We embedded information in human DNA, left caches of technology hidden around the world, and then we disappeared into the human gene pool." Helen squeezed Robert's shoulder. "I thought the bloodline had thinned enough. Your mother carried barely a trace. But your father, unknowing, carried traces too. When you were born, the old blood ran strong again." Robert stood and walked to the far side of the cell. "So I'm what? Some kind of genetic throwback." "You're a bridge," Helen said, "between what was and what is. The dragons recognize the Ardent signature in your DNA. It triggers their oldest instincts. The bond our people shared with them for millions of years. They're terrified of me. They're confused. The bond has been dormant for so long. They feel it activating but don't understand what it means." Helen stood and joined him. "With training, you could learn to control it, to communicate with them the way our ancestors did." Dr. Kwan was typing frantically on her data pad. "This explains everything. The bone density, the reflexes, the neural patterns I couldn't identify. You're carrying active Ardent DNA." A thought struck Robert. If the dragons are scattered across the galaxy, if they've been away from Earth for millions of years, why do they all still respond to Ardent blood? Helen smiled slightly. Because we coded it into their genetics before we sent them away. Made sure they would remember. Made sure that if any Ardent survived, the dragons would recognize them. But why? Robert asked. If your people were dying anyway, why make sure the dragons would remember? Hope, Helen said simply. We hoped that maybe, someday, the bloodline would resurface, that the bond could be renewed, that everything we were wouldn't be completely lost. The door burst open. A station officer stood there, face pale. We have a problem. A KRYLL warship just dropped out of jump space. They're demanding we surrender Robert Hayes immediately. Dr. Kwan jumped to her feet. The KRYLL? Why would they care about this? Helen's face went hard. Because they remember too. The KRYLL served the Ardent once. Worked for us. When we faded, they saw it as abandonment. They've been searching for surviving Ardent bloodlines for thousands of years. To help them? Robert asked. To punish them, Helen said quietly. To make us pay for leaving them behind. The officer's communicator crackled. Station commander to all sections. We're being boarded. KRYLL soldiers are breaching airlocks on levels 3 and 7. Helen pulled the warm stone from her satchel and pressed it into Robert's hand. You need to learn fast, grandson. The dragons are about to be your only chance of survival. And mine. Robert looked at the stone, then at his grandmother. How do I use this? You don't. You use yourself. Helen placed her hand over his. Close your eyes. Feel the warmth. That's your blood remembering what it used to be. What it still is. Alarm screamed throughout the station. The war for Robert's future had begun. The KRYLL moved through the station like a dark tide. Robert watched them on the security monitors in the cell. They were tall, armored in black plating that seemed to absorb light. Their faces were hidden behind helmets shaped like skulls. They've been waiting for this moment for thousands of years, Helen said, watching the screens. They see us as traitors, abandoners. They won't just kill us. They'll make it slow. Dr. Kwan was on her communicator, arguing with someone. I don't care about jurisdiction. We have civilians here. You can't just hand them over. The station commander's voice came through, tired and defeated. The KRYLL have 40 warships, Dr. Kwan. We have 2 security cutters and a lot of angry merchants. What do you suggest I do? Robert held the warm stone and felt nothing but smooth rock. No connection, no ancient power, nothing but panic rising in his chest. Grandma, I don't know how to do this. You've been doing it already, Helen said. You just haven't been aware of it. Every time the dragons ran from you, that was the bond trying to activate. You were calling to them without knowing how. They ran because they were scared. They ran because you were scared. The bond works both ways, Robert. They felt your fear and responded with their own. Helen took his face in her hands. You need to feel something else now. Something stronger than fear. The door to the security wing exploded inward. KRYLL soldiers poured through, weapons raised. Their leader pointed at Robert. The Ardent bloodline. Surrender it now, and the station will be spared. Dr. Kwan stepped between them and the cell. He's under my protection. The KRYLL leader tilted his head. You're willing to die for him. I'm a scientist. I'm willing to die for knowledge. And he represents the most important discovery in galactic history. The KRYLL considered this. Then he shot her. The blast hit Dr. Kwan in the shoulder, spinning her around. She collapsed with a cry of pain. Robert screamed and slammed his hands against the cell wall. Something inside him snapped. Heat flooded through his body. The stone in his hand blazed bright enough to hurt his eyes. And somewhere deep in the station, the dragons responded. Their roar shook the entire structure. Not fear this time. Rage. The KRYLL leader took a step back. What did you do? Robert didn't know. He only knew that the warmth spreading through him felt right. Felt like coming home after a long journey. Felt like waking up from a dream that had lasted his entire life, that he could feel them now. All of them. 15 dragons scattered throughout the station's military wing. Feel their hearts beating, their wings flexing, their ancient blood singing in harmony with his own. They were asking him a question. Not in words, but in something deeper than language. What do you need? Robert looked at the KRYLL soldiers. Looked at Dr. Kwan bleeding on the floor. looked at his grandmother, standing calm and ready beside him. Help, he thought. We need help. The dragons answered. Containment cells throughout the military wing shattered simultaneously. 15 dragons of different sizes and colors burst free. They didn't panic, didn't flee. They moved with purpose, flowing through corridors toward Robert's location like a tide of scales and fire. The KRYLL and the security wing heard them coming. Their leader barked orders, and his soldiers formed a defensive line. But nothing could have prepared them for what happened next. The first dragon hit them like a living battering ram. Silver scales flashing, claws extended, it scattered KRYLL soldiers like toys. A second dragon, this one deep red, landed on top of the blast door they destroyed and roared loud enough to crack the viewport glass. But they weren't killing. Robert realized that with shock. The dragons were carefully avoiding lethal strikes, using their massive bodies to pin and trap rather than tear and rend, because he didn't want them to kill. And they could feel that. Robert, Helen said quietly, you need to open this cell. The bond works better without barriers. He touched the lock mechanism. Didn't know how to override it, didn't have the codes. But the stone was still warm in his hand, and his blood was still singing. He pushed feeling into the lock. Need, urgency, open now. The lock clicked, and the cell door slid open. Robert stepped out into chaos. Dragons filled the corridor, their massive bodies barely fitting in the space. The KRYLL were retreating, dragging their wounded with them. Their leader stared at Robert with something like awe mixed with hatred. Ardent, the KRYLL said, we thought you were all gone. Not gone, Helen said, stepping up beside Robert. Just sleeping. The dragon with silver scales lowered its head toward Robert. Up close, it was even more massive than he'd realized. Its eyes were golden, ancient, knowing. It made a sound deep in its throat. Robert understood it. Not words, but meaning. Recognition. Welcome. Finally, he reached out slowly and touched the dragon's scaled nose. Warmth flowed between them. Images flashed through his mind. Earth green and wild. Flying over endless forests. A connection that went deeper than thought. This is impossible, someone whispered. Robert turned and saw Orin, the merchant lord, standing at the edge of the corridor. His face showed shock. Dragons don't bond anymore. They haven't truly bonded with anyone in recorded history. Because there haven't been any Ardent to bond with, Helen said. Until now, more KRYLL were coming. Robert could hear them advancing through the station. Dozens, maybe hundreds. The dragons around him tensed, ready to fight. But Robert didn't want war. Didn't want death. He closed his eyes and reached deeper into the connection, feeling for something his grandmother had mentioned. The old knowledge embedded in his DNA there. A memory that wasn't his. A voice that spoke without sound. He opened his eyes and looked at the KRYLL leader. I'm not my ancestors. I didn't abandon you. I didn't even exist when they made their choices. Bloodline guilt, the KRYLL said. Your people's crimes are yours. No, Robert said firmly. But I can offer you something they never could. A chance to start fresh. The dragons are waking up. The bond is coming back. That changes everything. For everyone. The KRYLL leader hesitated. What are you proposing? I don't know yet, Robert admitted. But killing me won't bring your ancestors back. Won't undo the past. All it does is make sure nothing changes. The KRYLL stood silent. The dragons waited. The entire station held its breath. Finally, the KRYLL leader lowered his weapon. We will withdraw. For now. But this conversation isn't over, Ardent. I hope not, Robert said. The medical bay smelled of antiseptic and burnt flesh. Dr. Kwan lay on a table while a medical drone worked on her shoulder. She was pale but conscious, managing a weak smile when Robert and Helen entered. Dramatic rescue, she said. Thank you. I'm sorry, Robert said. If I hadn't been here, none of this would have happened. If you hadn't been here, we'd never have discovered one of the most important pieces of xenobiology in history. Dr. Kwan winced as the drone injected something into her arm. Worth getting shot for. Helen touched the scientist's uninjured shoulder. You stood between him and armed soldiers. That took courage. That took stupidity, Dr. Kwan said. but I appreciate the generous interpretation. Outside the medical bay, the station was slowly returning to normal. The KRYLL had withdrawn to their ships, maintaining a blockade, but no longer boarding. The dragons had been moved to a larger hangar, specially cleared for them. None had been returned to containment cells. Robert could feel them even from here, a warm presence at the back of his mind. Oren found them an hour later. The Tralian merchant lord looked different without his usual arrogance. Almost humble. "I owe you an apology," he said to Robert. "I demanded you be tested, removed, punished. I didn't understand what I was asking." "You were scared for your dragon," Robert said. "I get it. He's calm now. For the first time since I acquired him. Actually, happy even." Oren paused. "I've owned dragons for 30 years. Never seen one truly content before. They've always seemed restless, like they were searching for something." "They were," Helen said quietly. "They were searching for us." The station commander called a meeting in the main conference room. Representatives from a dozen species crowded in, all wanting to see Robert, to understand what had happened. The silver dragon had followed him to the conference level and now waited outside, its massive head visible through the viewport. Robert stood before them, feeling small and overwhelmed. Helen stood beside him, steady as always. "I'm not a leader," Robert said. "I'm not a diplomat. 2 weeks ago, I was hauling cargo and worrying about ship repairs. I don't know how to handle any of this." An elderly woman with scales instead of skin stepped forward. She was a Volheran, a species known for keeping historical records. "Young Ardent, I've spent my life studying dragon lore. Stories my people passed down for generations. We always believed the dragon lords were myths. But our oldest texts say they would return when the galaxy needed them most." "The galaxy doesn't need me," Robert said. "I'm just one person." "You're more than that," Dr. Kwan said from her wheelchair at the back of the room. "Your DNA could help us understand evolution, bonding, even consciousness itself. But more than that, you're a living bridge between past and present." Oren spoke up. "The dragons have been tools for too long. Weapons, status symbols. Maybe with the bond restored, that can change." Robert looked at his grandmother. "What do you think?" Helen smiled. "I think you can't go back to hauling cargo, grandson. Whether you want it or not, you've become important. The question is what you do with that." Robert walked to the viewport and looked at the silver dragon. It met his eyes, and again he felt that wordless communication. Trust, partnership, possibility. "The KRYLL said this isn't over," Robert said. "They're going to want answers. Maybe revenge." "Then we give them answers," Helen said. "We find other Ardent bloodlines. The coordinates I carry lead to stasis chambers. Others like us might still be sleeping, waiting. And if we wake them, then the dragons won't be alone anymore. And neither will you." Dr. Kwan wheeled herself forward. "I want to come with you, to document this, to study it. This is the scientific discovery of a lifetime. It'll be dangerous," Robert warned. "I just got shot by angry aliens for defending you. I think I can handle dangerous." 3 dragon handlers volunteered to join them. One was a young woman who'd worked with the silver dragon. She said her dragon had been asking, in its own way, to go with Robert. "How do you know?" Robert asked. She smiled. "Because for the first time ever, it's talking to me. Really talking. Showing me images, feelings. It's like a wall between us finally broke down." They spent the next 2 days preparing. Helen's coordinates pointed to a system far beyond charted space. Getting there would require ships, supplies, and a lot of luck. Oren offered to fund the expedition in exchange for being allowed to send observers. "The Stellar Cup races can wait," he said. "This is more important." The night before departure, Robert stood in the hangar with the dragons. All 15 of them. They'd sorted themselves somehow, and now 3 clearly intended to come with him. The silver one, a deep green one, and a smaller bronze-colored juvenile. He touched each of their snouts, feeling the bond strengthen. They showed him fragments of memory, flying over worlds he'd never seen, waiting through long years for something they couldn't name. Finding it, finally, in him, Helen joined him in the quiet hangar. "Your parents would be proud. They didn't know what I was." "No, but they knew who you were. Kind, careful, thoughtful. That matters more than genetics." Helen handed him the leather satchel. This is yours now. The seeds, the samples, the knowledge. The legacy of our people. I'm scared, Robert admitted. Good. Fear means you're taking this seriously. Helen smiled. But you're not alone. You have me. You have Dr. Kwan. You have volunteers willing to travel into unknown space with you. And you have them. She gestured to the dragons. Robert looked at the ships being prepared for launch. At the faces of the people who'd chosen to join this journey. At the grandmother who'd traveled across space to tell him the truth. At the dragons who'd been waiting millions of years for his bloodline to resurface that he was a cargo hauler. He moved things from one place to another. Maybe that's exactly what the galaxy needed right now. Someone to move it from what it was to what it could be. The silver dragon lowered its head and Robert leaned against the warm scales. Through the bond, he felt its certainty, its absolute conviction that this was right, that they were meant to find each other, that everything would work out, that he chose to believe it. 2 days later, they left Freeport 7. 5 ships, 3 dragons, and a crew of 15, heading toward coordinates that might hold sleeping Ardent or might hold nothing but empty chambers and broken dreams. But as the station shrank behind them and the vast unknown opened ahead, Robert felt something he hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. The dragons flew alongside the ships, their wings spread against the starfield. They weren't running anymore. They were flying toward something. Toward home. Toward the bond they'd carried in their blood for 70 million years. Helen stood beside Robert at the viewport. Welcome to your true family. Welcome to the Ardent legacy. Now let's see what we make of it. Robert watched the stars and the dragons and the future unfolding before him. Whatever they made of it, he knew one thing for certain, that IT would be interesting.